This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Please welcome to the program. It's like fifth or sixth time. Friend of the show, Michael Johns, one of the founders of the National Tea Party movement. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Todd. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good, man. I'm hanging in. Whereabouts are you right now? Where are you?
I am. Today, I find myself outside of Washington, D.C. So on a little project down here, and then back to the Philadelphia area.
Well, when's the last time you've been in the White House,
Toronto.
Michael? What's that? What's that? What'd you say? Sorry.
I've been in several times during this administration.
Wow.
So yeah, I always joke it's like stopping by the old work compound. They got a great new boss. It's intriguing. And for anyone who visits Washington D.C., a tour of the White House is a must. I think it's the East Wing, very vibrant and just hugely intriguing rooms, and the history, of course, that goes back so far in our country, and the evolution of the White House over the years. It's a great story.
Oh, man, without a doubt. I sort of always chuckle when you hear, whether it's these baseball teams or basketball teams or football teams, even hockey teams, when players are like, we're not going to the White House. And I even if you disagree completely with the leader in the White House and leader of the free world, isn't it a great opportunity to, I would say, to one, appreciate that history you speak of, Michael Johns, and, almost celebrate and honor those presidents that meant something to you. I'm sure there's, great pictures and great memorials of or just accomplishments that they've done, or even at least being where they would walk for 4 to 8 years. And the other thing is, and maybe I'm wrong, but you, obviously, Donald Trump to some extent. I almost feel like if you were a big-time athlete, and you actually didn't agree with something with Donald Trump and took that time to say, hey, do you mind if I have 30 seconds with you in a very sort of approachable manner and not defensive and not aggressive, and said, Mr. President, I don't like XXX. Is there a way we could have a further conversation at some point from it? I feel like he'd be the type of guy who would take that on.
Well, hey, you got like a whole bunch of examples of prominent celebrities and athletes most of whom have had some, at least modest relationship with Trump through the years, given that he was, a television personality and, with casinos and his own engagement in the sporting world, especially boxing. He has, a long list, a long Rolodex there in that world. So, I think absolutely. And I'm glad the Chiefs are going. Not sure when that is, but I did see that Andy Reid came out and said absolutely. It was an honor. I like the way he positioned that and phrased it. And this whole thing's like a new phenomenon. I can remember like a couple decades ago, you would have, like Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. They would literally call into the locker rooms, to congratulate them on their victories. And it was one of the highlights of winning a sports championship was the opportunity to visit the White House. This whole politicization of that process is greatly unfortunate because, if you're an athlete, you're not endorsing President Trump by showing up at the White House to have your team celebrated. You're simply acknowledging the magnitude of that office and the importance of that opportunity and event.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Michael Johns. And listen, we obviously think alike when it comes to that. Why do you think it is in these days that people seem to make that issue and not recognize maybe the value of actually stepping foot in there? Again, even with this agreeing to disagree mentality, why do people have to draw such a line in the sand?
Right. It's here's my view on it. I think it's groupthink and peer pressure. The fact is that the radical left in this country has become just increasingly, with this whole cancel culture, very organized, very dogmatic, very unforgiving, and very, generally very successful, I have to say. To give them some props for that. Their tactics, unfortunately, even though they're ones I don't support, of intimidation, boycott, et cetera, are ones that put a lot of fear into people. So it sort of creates a little bit of an autocratic political culture where you're part of a world where, peers lay on you and you kind of, I guess at some point maybe it's not important enough for you to stand up for your individuality, but that's, in my view, the collapse of individual freedom in the country when we reach that point, and I hope we never do reach that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of different points you guys are reaching. So what's the latest with the administration? What's sort of today's every day there's new news. What's today's news, Michael Johns?
Well, I mean, I think really the most encouraging thing is, to have Trump acquitted in the Senate, and now, to see basically on a polling basis, he's coming in, at 50%, which is certainly on par, even a little higher in some ways than where Obama was at this point in his presidency. Perception that he has survived and emerged victorious from this unjustified, unwarranted, and ultimately unsuccessful impeachment effort that was hugely politicized. And simultaneously, that almost all of these metrics on the performance of the country are just overwhelmingly positive. I mean, he really has the economy humming quite well. I think it's one of the reasons when you look at, so far we've been through Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary, the turnout for Democrats in those two states has been underwhelming. Not up to par, not certainly what party leadership has promised. And I think part of that is that the socialist schemes of $100 trillion in new spending and vast expansions of government to over 70% of GDP of the whole country are not things that are appealing at this moment to a lot of Americans. They seem out of line, unjustified, not consistent with American values, dangerous. And I think that's kept some Democrats at home. And then simultaneously on the other side, you have this huge Trump rally up in Manchester, New Hampshire, which was, in my view, one of his most successful to date. And I don't think he's had any that haven't been successful. Just, a packed stadium there in Manchester, sold the place out, thousands of people outside, people waiting outside to get in before the event. And then you sort of compare that with like a Biden event where he's got, like 75, 100 people in a high school gymnasium. They look half asleep. There's no energy. There's no excitement. I think years from now, people will look back on the Trump campaign tactics, whatever you think of Trump, and you're going to say this was like an unbelievable cultural phenomenon. And I have said that I believe in many ways the Tea Party movement sort of laid the groundwork for this. I mean, we used a rally-based, organization and bringing people together, having an ability and opportunity for them to, to learn and to validate their own views, to know they're not alone. And that creates an exciting political organizational culture, and it incentivizes people for voting. I mean, there's almost no way you're going to show up at, a Trump rally in Manchester, New Hampshire on the eve of a primary that he's going to win overwhelmingly, where there's essentially no primary contest, and then not show up in November to vote for him. So I think the process is one that's working, and I think it's one he's going to continue at an ever-growing pace here over the course of this election cycle, including through the primary cycle, which he's not taking for granted. And I just think his candidacy is looking really positive and formidable. He's raising a lot of money. He's polling is up. Economy and numbers are going well. And I think, for the most part, the American people kind of have looked at him a little bit as a victim, as you and I have talked about, through this process. I mean, they just didn't really, obviously it was a complete exoneration on Russian collusion. And on this Ukraine thing, it was like, well, hold on a second. I mean, you did release the aid. We didn't get any quid pro quo, It didn't add up, I don't think, in minds of most Americans. Most Americans were not particularly glued into it because I think they saw it, through that lens.
Michael Johns is with us, and clearly you support this administration, support this president. And you mentioned the Tea Party, and you being one of the founders of the National Tea Party movement. What do you reply to people when they say, well, the Tea Party stands for bigotry or racism or an old boys club. It's sort of elitist. These are reports at times. A little bit alt-right. How do you reply to those types of statements?
Well, first, just to be honest with you, it's like hugely hurtful because I know thousands upon thousands of people in this movement. I've worked with African Americans in the Tea Party movement in major leadership positions. I don't think we ever really did as much work as we should have done in representing the demographic breakdown of the Tea Party movement compared to, say, a Bernie Sanders rally. But I would argue that our African American participation exceeds that of a Bernie Sanders rally, and has excited. Now, do we have more work to do there? We do. And I think this president has been helpful in that regard with criminal justice reform, with not ignoring the plight of the cities, with not taking for granted the opportunity that exists to gain support in some of these urban communities that have been ignored, and pointing out the huge, unbelievable lack of success that's existed in most American cities under Democrat governance. I mean, crime rates up, education standards down, people fleeing the city, not sufficient tax revenue to sustain city services. Really, these American cities have really failed hugely. And in part, it's been because it's been one-party governance. And that's not just to denounce the ideology of the other party, but just to say also that lack of competition leads any politician to sort of take the electorate for granted. And I think that's been a big part of what's going on.
Have you yourself ever faced, whether it be threats or some, fear of violence around you, just based on your stance and your beliefs and you being obviously a very vocal and visual member?
Yeah, pretty commonly. And everyone responds to those things differently. I've seen people, sort of hover in the corner in absolute fear over it. I'm not saying that that's wrong. That's not, I've not looked at it that way. The way I've always looked at it is that I believe passions run very high and very deep on these issues. I acknowledge the fact that people that are on the other side of it are very dogmatic in their view. And I try to be respectful of the fact that they came to those conclusions somehow. And, so it's like I never personalize this. I never blame them individually. In some respects, it's sort of our fault. It's our challenge. I mean, my biggest metric in my view for whether or not I'm being successful are the ideas that we're communicating through the Republican Party, through the Tea Party movement, through the conservative movement in this country. Are we winning hearts and minds, or are we alienating people? And I was very disappointed for the last, 2008, 2012 with those presidential campaigns. I don't think that they reached out in the ways they needed to. I think this president's doing a much better job at it. But this is something that really has got to be at the core and attention of everything we do, not taking any community for granted, trying to be a party and movement that represents all of the people of the country, and, and a party that is a movement that's completely inclusive. So the bottom line answer to that is that's also, I think, a reaction on the left that has allowed them to avoid the serious conversations about the failure of their policies, the validity of our policies, the magnitude of people that have been drawn into both the Tea Party and Trump MAGA movements, tens of millions of people, and avoid serious discussions about those things, and to sort of write it off as that. But, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. It's a party that was formed on the basis of an end to slavery, and Republican Party was a champion of civil rights legislation in the 60s, and somehow the brand identity on those issues diluted, and I think we're starting to get it back. Trump did much better than Romney and McCain among African American voters and Hispanic voters in 2016. Wasn't widely reported. I think he's going to do even better in 2020. That he did in 2016, and maybe substantially better.
Michael, excuse me here. I got a little stuff in my throat going on. It's funny because I'm Canadian, as you know, and Canadians love American issues. But I think what we maybe don't understand that well is just the simple day-to-day of American life. And I'm sure it's not too dissimilar from ours. But the point of this question being is, I go to LA. Luckily, I go to New York. I have a radio show, so I can bring the media kind of wherever I want to do it, and I have friends and family and et cetera. And I get to visit Americans quite often. And I'll tell you one thing: if I were to never look at social media, and if I were to never have a radio show, and maybe not even follow politics in terms of who is in office at the time that I've been going over the last 15, 20 years, one thing I can tell you is that I've never really noticed the day-to-day of my friends or family's lives change. Meaning they still kind of have the same house, they drive the same cars, the kids go to schools. It seems like, they have the normal stresses of life, and careful spending and budgeting and things like this. But I mean, at the end of the day, do Americans' day-to-day lives change the way, if you were just to go on social media and Twitter, think that like this travesty has all of a sudden occurred because of a new administration?
I have always said, and I think it's true still today, that we have a lot of people struggling in the country. There's been people that have been uplifted by these policies, but there's also been whole industries that have been damaged, and the plight of blue collar workers in this country over the last few decades has not been particularly good. And a lot of that is, why I think Trump correctly has been placing trade policy and immigration policy at the forefront, and our tax policy. But those three things have kind of been at the core of not making us globally competitive, and fixing them is kind of at the core of making us hugely competitive in the world environment. But the broader answer to your question is the United States, like Canada, is a large and diverse country. I mean, if I say, hey, what's life like in Canada? Well, if you're sitting in downtown Toronto, it's one way. If you're out in Alberta, it's, a completely different life.
And sorry, just to interrupt you. After I asked the question, I was thinking, well, in a way, what do I know? Let's be honest. I know sort of middle to upper class individuals is the truth in terms of economic wealth. And for them, I don't know if I feel like their day to day really hasn't changed, because they wouldn't be necessarily affected by those hard blue collar jobs, and that's not sort of the elk that they're cut from. The only difference I would say about them is, most of them probably being very liberal and democratic, and man, do they complain a lot more. That's where they're dated. But I wonder if has it actually hit them, or is it just like a moral belief that they feel they need to get across?
I think people genuinely do understand that this macro, economic, political climate that they don't have control over in their minds affects them in profound ways. And it's at times it's been hugely helpful. At other times it's been really challenging and detrimental. And there are groups and populations of people in our country that have not escaped poverty, who need to, that probably have not received the amount of policy attention that they warrant, and policy creativity and getting those people beyond that. So I think a lot of it is the fact, and this is why, it kind of circles back to your earlier question. I think this is one of the reasons the passions run so deep, is that people realize that their personal lives and the lives of their kids are going to be affected by these big picture themes and these big picture issues. And, so if they're winning, they tend to be hugely enthusiastic about something, maybe overly enthusiastic about their candidate, their movement, their party, their ideas. And if they're losing, well, it's the downfall of Western civilization and all of the adjectives that end up being thrown at this president. And I'm sure were thrown at our previous president by those who opposed him. I know for a fact were. Ultimately, I think some of those can be exaggerated reactions, but it is undeniably true that we have a complete battle in this country for what kind of country we really want to be. And if you look at the agenda that, particularly Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are presenting, that's a different country. That's waking up 8 years from now and saying this place isn't like it used to be. That's not moving the needle in a marginal way. That is a mammoth shift in making this country essentially socialist, and that runs, I think, antithetical to the founding of the country, and it's antithetical in the minds of most Americans about how it should run. And I don't think too many Americans believe it will be successful. They don't see the historical examples of that. They see just the opposite.
Michael Johns, what would fear you most about, say, a Bernie Sanders presidency? I mean, listen, I don't think the guy can win, but what would fear you the most?
Well, I just think you would see capital, jobs, and opportunities flee this country massively and quickly, because we are in a global economy right now, and you're going to put that kind of tax burden on the American people, and you're going to suffocate private industry with those kind of regulations, and you're going to take over the healthcare industry, which is over 20% of GDP of the whole country. You're just going to see a real dramatic and negative impact, and it's going to come pretty quickly because there are countries that that industry companies are and even individuals are not going to be subject to that kind of policy proposal. I mean, you're just talking about a really, really dramatic shift. And I mean, essentially $100 trillion in new spending. It's almost, I realize that's a number it's difficult for, like typical people to even get their heads around, but it's a number that would take, the percentage of our economy dedicated to government from, roughly 38% now to, over 70%. And that's just ends up being a different environment, a different methodology to how we, live our lives and how the country operates.
I will say, though, being a Canadian, the idea of not having free health care, it's obviously just foreign to me because, here I am, 46 years of age, and that's just always been the case. Is there no way to coexist, like not to go to the extreme, but not to find this kind of system that Canada has in place? Have there been studies on that? How that's been done? Is it the fear that taxes will be paid too much to achieve that? And again, I don't know the economics behind it, sadly, but why can't that happen?
Yeah, I wish I could. I think I can remember a few years ago citing a number of the biggest champions of Canada's healthcare system who had encountered their own individual healthcare problems. And the first thing they did was come down to the Mayo Clinic and other major U.S. facilities to have their procedures done. To me, that says an awful lot, meaning they support this system for the purposes of the masses, but when it comes to the protection of their and saving of their own lives, they're quick to come down here. So I think from the standpoint of access to care, like speed of care, and the quality of care, the United States is the leader in the world. Where we're struggling and where we're challenged is figuring out how should healthcare be paid for. Is it a public or a private sector commodity ultimately? And we kind of have this we do this balancing act really between the two. We want the best of both those worlds. And to some extent, I think it's possible to have the best of both worlds without having a government-run system. Because once you put government in control of an entire industry like that, it's all going to be about cost containment. It's not going to be about individual personalized care. It's not going to be about cutting edge technologies or expanding pharmaceutical or surgical innovations. All of that stuff is going to be not, hugely impressive. And the U.S. continues to be really the leader in the world as far as healthcare innovation goes. And one of the reasons is that we've allowed healthcare to be profitable. And that in turn has created another series of problems that now need to be addressed.
Michael Johns is with us, and as someone who really just finished telling you that, I can't imagine life without it, I have to call that, and I'll stand by that statement, free healthcare, and feel like it should be available to really anyone in the world, I wish. But you are right, and I always say when there's sort of hypocrisies, whether I think I'm hypocritical or others, they should be called upon. And back to, the people that I'm fortunate enough to know, whether, they have some money, they always have gone to America to get taken care of. I will say a two-tiered system, so to speak, that they find ways to go and do. And it's kind of interesting that if they really, felt the need just to be like every other Canadian, they would kind of wait their due course to get the CAT scan or to get the major surgery or to get the cancer medication that's still in a trial stage that maybe has already passed some sort of different status in the United States. So yeah, listen. I understand that part of it, and it's really interesting. And the one thing I think we can all hopefully agree on is that we do want a better life for really everyone, and we hope somehow we can achieve that. Michael, I really enjoy these chats. I think they're very candid and very honest. Sorry?
Absolutely, that is what it's all about, Todd.
Oh, thank you, man. Well, listen, we'll catch up probably next week, and we do always appreciate your support on your very strong following on your side too. And thank you again for your time,
my friend.
Okay,
good
Michael,
talking with you.
Cheers.
This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.